Hello everyone, this is Sonia Byers, CEO of Women in Transport, and you're listening to the Women in Transport podcast. Here we uncover how the intersection of identities produces different experiences for different people. While some identities may be more privileged due to their class, race, gender or faith, others may experience inordinate discrimination. Join us as we hear from the Women in Transport and take an inspiring and analytical lens through which we will understand how power and privilege interface and cross over.
Hello and welcome to the Women in Transport podcast. I'm your host Shireen Ali-Khan, and this time around we are celebrating Black History Month with this year's theme being all around saluting our sisters. So without further ado, I am surrounded by some amazing sisters today. So let's hand over to them.
I'm Mel Clarke. I'm the Health, Safety and Wellbeing Director at National Highways.
My name is Marcia Williams and I'm the Diversity Inclusion Change Lead for all the customer operations for Transport for London. Wow.
Hello, I'm Jackie Anyango. I'm Inclusion Lead for Galliford Try across the group.
So I'm Lorraine Mhonyera. I am a project manager by day. I'm not an EDI champion at all, but I'm the founder of Ethnicity and Race and Rail.
Absolutely, welcome. And that's the point of it, is have those mixed voices actually, because we want people who are not in the EDI world to be listening to these podcasts and really to understand those nuances that make us who we are, and kind of break away from that, some of that language that we get lost in, and really just talk about the crux of who we are as human beings. I think that brings us really nicely actually into talking a bit about the context of today's podcast and maybe in some of the questions. So we are celebrating Black History Month, and this year's theme is around saluting your sisters. We did speak about whether that was the right theme or not, but actually we are saluting our sisters. I've got 5 women on the call, got 4 amazing Black women who are going to talk to us about their journeys, what it really means to be a person. So what great way to really celebrate who we are as human beings. So thank you so much for joining me today. And my first question is very much to kind of break the ice on the conversations and just talk about, what does representation really mean for each of you individually? But what does it mean when we speak about representation and professional realm, personal realm? These are words that we use a lot. What does it mean to you? Jackie, I'm going to come to you first, and then anyone else that wants to jump in.
So for me, representation really means being clear that you're only speaking from your own narrative and your own upbringing. So it depends on what identities you carry. Your decisions are going to be around that. And what I mean is, for me, I'm a Black female. So how I turn up at work is I'll consider not only people from other groups, but I'll be very acute to what it means being Black in England, what it means to also be a majority. So any decisions I'm a bit mindful of. Also, how do I convey that message so I bring people along the journey? And how am I encouraging people who I know are probably going through the things that I went through in my career, or some concerns of where I felt I had to fit in? I think for me, the one of fitting in is something that I really think is the worst part of assimilation. So representation is just giving people that platform to be themselves so that they can just go to work and get their jobs done and do the things that they need to do, other than thinking about everything that might go against them or they're trying to fit in. So just embracing who they are, knowing the beauty of who they are, is for me what representation, what I try and represent in how I turn up in the workplace and the decisions that I make.
Amazing. And how do you do that for yourself?
For myself, I think construction was a hard one, because I didn't really see people who kind of looked like me, but also I'm not the most, I'm not someone that will fit in anyway. So I connect with women or other people who I see are quite similar to me, and kind of get to see whether am I on my own being like this, or, and actually females have been a mixture. They've been both Black, white, Asians, but actually just talking to others. Especially, I'm someone who I've always been quite clear. I want to be successful in my career, but I always want to make sure I cast the right shadow. So it's been reaching out and listening to women who've made that mark. I think Mel knows this. I think I said it to her a while ago. I was like, she was a great role model. So when I see women like Mel, for me, it's really important, and it's nice that Mel just is herself. I've never seen her be quite different, whether she's in person, whether she's presenting, whether she's talking, she's herself. So I try and connect with those people and follow them, read their stuff. So that's how I stay true to myself. It's interesting, isn't it? It's kind of, you connect with people so that you kind of help connect, stay true to yourself. I don't know if I just made sense, but that's it.
No, it did, absolutely. And never second guess yourself. It always makes sense. Mel, I'm going to come to you because you're name dropped there loads.
Yeah, you've got name drop then. So I mean, watch it. So it's everything that Jackie just said. Really, it's creating. So my job's health, safety, and wellbeing. Yeah, that's my day job, has been for the last year or so. And you can't be well, and actually it can have an impact on your health, and actually potentially even have an impact on your safety if you don't feel psychologically safe. When you show up for work, that's part of the deal, isn't it? And part of that is feeling that you can be authentic, that you can just be yourself when you're in the workplace. So if you don't feel represented, and you're part of the representation as well, that's a really interesting thing. It's like people like myself and Jackie and others on the call, we're part of the representation. We represent, we turn up to represent, don't we, ladies? And that's really important, because it is about making those connections with others. Because for me, representation, it's about the amplification of voices. So if we are working in situations where our voice is a minority voice, so it's perhaps a workplace that is predominantly white males, for example, then there's a small representation of voice, and it's about the amplification of that. So how do you amplify the voices of marginalised groups, or people that aren't being fully represented, not just to address the balance, but so that everybody can have better connections and conversations? Because only in reality we're more similar than we are different. That's always been my experience. Particularly, what really struck me when Jackie was talking then was about making those connections, and actually it's not about necessarily connecting with somebody who's exactly like you. It's not necessarily looking for people who are like you to sort of forge that path, but it is about saying, who can I connect to that is different to me, but understands some of the challenges that I have. And in that way, you represent as well, because then you are somebody that people can connect to and connect with, and continue that dialogue. So I think it's really important. There's a bit of growing up and experience that we all have when it comes to representation. So we'll all have our stories about what it felt like when we were little and we didn't feel represented, compared to what we feel about it now, like me, when you're in my 50s, and what that feels like. And what I'd like to positively record is that my experiences have got better, but that's been a lot to do with me choosing to represent as well, and me making that conscious choice to be part of that representation. So I think that's what it means to me. It's not just to see it, but it's also to be part of the representation. It's really important.
I find it really interesting, Mel. I know from a lot of the work that you've done, it's around experiencing those times where it wasn't ideal, you felt isolated, and you thought, I'm going to do something about this. And I think, I've just written some notes, Jackie and Mel, as you were speaking around, I'd love for you to delve a bit more, Mel, around what psychological safety really means, and that amplification of voices. You did say that you don't have to look like another person to have a connection, or sound like them to have another connection, but actually you can have connections through understanding, and maybe it's your values, maybe it's shared values that brings people together, both in the professional and personal realm. But I'd love you just to talk a bit more about psychological safety, please, and that amplification of voices.
Yeah, so I mean, it's something that I'm really just learning about, actually, and particularly as I delve more into the world of sort of health and wellbeing, and the real impact, actually, that people who don't feel psychologically safe to kind of report things or call things out. And that can be in the safety space. I'm very much in the sort of, if people walk on by things, then people get hurt. But actually, it's absolutely the same when it comes to psychological safety. If people can't feel comfortable about saying things that are challenging for them in the workplace, then you can cause psychological harm. You can cause health and wellbeing harms. You can impact them through stress in the workplace, or that sense of being victimized, or perhaps harassed or bullied. That subtle almost less tangible sort of impacts of the sort of covert behaviours that sometimes go on, and actually not being able to say, actually, I don't like it when you say those things, or I don't like it when you have certain beliefs that are based in assumption about people like me or other people, because you just don't know us, is really interesting. So I think I'm one where you create that psychological safety by opening up these conversations, because the more you're exposing each other to, the fact of being a human being, as I said, you come back to, you end up with more similarities than differences, and the differences suddenly start to not matter, because you're all talking about similarities, because we love to connect on things that we all have in common, don't we? We don't connect on differences, we connect on commonality. And guess what? Most of us will 90% have something 90% in common with the next person to them, and the differences are so unimportant. So psychological safety for me is creating that safe environment. And that means you have to be quite open about what your own biases might be, actually. And that's always been. So I always have this view. I as you know, set up a leading women's network. But I went into that with the absolute view that I'm one example of a woman. I'm not the everyday woman. Every woman is different. So actually, I went into that thinking, guess what I'm going to have to do? I'm going to have to learn loads about women. And I think it's the same when you're thinking about creating psychological safety. It's, guess what I'm going to have to do? I'm going to have to learn about everybody who I'm inviting into this safe space, and make sure that their voices are heard, and that we have that amplification of the smaller voices in that group, because that we will learn something and we'll create this safe environment for everybody, and people will talk more and they'll connect more, and it will just be better. And that's where the representation happens in truth.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you, Mel. Marcia, I'd like to bring you in at this point.
So interesting hearing from both Jackie and Mel. Mel, you're fabulous, by the way. So from my point of view, for me, and it's more about, how do I say this? Knowing me, showing my vulnerabilities, understanding my intent. Is it selfishness? Is it for the breadth of our people? Is it the breadth, right? Knowing that what we have gone through, and I know we had the pre-conversation with Jackie when we were having a great conversation, right? And there's still anger there. How do we recognize the anger, right? And how do we show the anger and the frustration that we've gone through, but in a clear, unopposing way to the opposite people? Because you know the analogies, right? That black people are always angry, etc., and we do have a right. But for the representation, right, as I say, looking at me, right, what have I gone through? What do I understand that I've gone through? Yeah. And by understanding what I've gone through and my vulnerabilities, can show me in a different light, right, that I'm not the only one. So as Mel said, right, creating a safe space, right, what is that space we are trying to create? Yeah, you have to have a psychological part with it. And Mel said about where we have to know women. You're right, but if you're looking at the domain that I'm working with, right, is how do I convince these people, right, the narrative, what I'm trying to achieve to the end goal, which for me is about inclusion, and creating that safe people, which allows people, right, to be open and honest. And I had a session this morning, right, and I said to them, right, we know racism within the company. And I kept on and reading foundation and supporting them and saying, look, this stays in this room. It doesn't go anywhere. It's not for performance or etc. And then people started to come out and challenge, right, particularly the white people, right, I don't believe this policy. I don't believe this, right, I don't believe what faith, whatever it is. So the cycle always changes. How do we, right, have confidence, right, to create that safe space so people can talk? Now, the meeting I had this month was predominantly around the black women, right? And when we started the conversation, right, they were quiet. So again, right, I said, why are you so quiet? I know your history. We have been there, maybe in different ways, but how do we start to talk about it? How do we represent, right, as a human being in a particular population which has gone through trials and tribulations, which we're still going through trials and tribulations, but to talk about it for the others to listen, to understand. Again, we were talking about these staff network groups, and I don't belong to it because I'm not a woman, I don't have a neurodiversity, I'm not caring and all this lot. How do we use that network to, right, for them to listen educate, understand, show your vulnerability, right, which will lead to inclusion. For me personally, what I'm trying to do within the business is, and I wish I was far as along the road as Mel and probably Jackie and all this up, but I've already started this role in November, which I really start to concentrate on, is how do we get people to understand, listen, educate, show their true intent, show their vulnerability, you know, and have the conviction, right, to call it out. Yeah, obviously, right, you have to set the foundation, right, because you can't say, right, Shireen, right, I didn't like what you said, right, by the way, How do we give them confidence to say, right, you know something, right, during the conversation, right, I didn't like what you said. And then how do we give the people to the other side to say, right, I'm terribly sorry, right, let's have a conversation to understand the effect of my words on you. Learn, educate, share, move on. Best practice and things like that. And that's how we need to come represent. Now, as a Black woman, right, we all know how to represent. Again, we have to look within ourselves, right? We've been fighting this battle, right? I've been fighting this battle 40 odd years, even though I look young. But if I'm fighting the battle, right, the same way I've been fighting the battle, right, and we're still in the same place, even though it has moved on, we have to reflect with ourselves, right, how do we become different? So I think I've spoken enough now because I can speak for years.
No, I love that, and there's all really different perspectives, which is why we're having this conversation, because it isn't this is how it is and that's how it should be for everybody. It is all that variance. And Lorraine, I want to bring you in now to share your experiences, please.
So on representation, I think from a work perspective and a personal perspective, I feel like it's always changing. There's some elements in my work life whereby I'm fully represented, and some elements in my personal life I'm not represented. So it's always just an interchanging sort of narrative for me. But when it comes to work, especially if you're working for an organization like Network Rail, you've broken that glass ceiling, you're in there. So see, everybody else, you're looking as if you've been represented, or you're representing yourself, or you're actually doing something for, the Black community. But it just doesn't end with breaking that glass ceiling. I think the representation is actually from what you take out when you're in that space and in that narrative. And I'm not too sure if everyone is familiar with the Black-ish terminology, whereby if you start having to have talents, or if your life is moving away from the biases that are associated with Black women, for example, if I speak lovely, if I dress well, and if I don't speak that narrative, I'm somehow Blackish now. And I've seen this in my own personal circumstance as well, because I'm at Oxford University, and they give scholarships to Black students, which is 100% scholarship. So I didn't get that scholarship, and I was horribly, devastated. But to the world, to everyone I say I'm going to Oxford, they're like, "Oh wow, you're making it," will they say? But to the system, I'm not there, because they awarded scholarships to people who I believe had the Blackish lifestyle of, they've got master's degrees already, they work for big organizations, and they've sort of like moved away from that bias that fits, or that puts us all into this, oh, you're Black because you're supposed to be like this. So it's representation for me. It's so tricky, because you think you're there, but you're never there, and it's always another struggle, another challenge. And I blame the system, because no matter what happens, I feel like if the system that feeds in that psychological safety, should I say, if they write down and say, oh, Lorraine said this to someone during a performance review today, the system is going to be like, oh, red flag, So the system also needs to be able to incorporate how we feel and what we're raising, and not penalize us for raising our psychological concerns, I feel. But I could go on and on about representation, but that's just my 2 cents around that, I feel.
No, absolutely. And it's a very welcome 2 cents. I've written down some key takeaways and some questions that would naturally derive from this. So in everyone speaking, role models was mentioned quite a lot. We've got psychological safety, authenticity, that amplification of voices, that feeling better connected. It's difficult, but seeking to understand. Then we've had to understand, but actually that means to be vulnerable. And then around the fluidity and the constant changing nature of what representation looks like. So you can't say on a Monday you've nailed it, and on a Tuesday it's all the same, because we know that things fluctuate, whether it's in the work, whether it's even if it's just politics, like everything is so fluid that idea of representation changes with time, I guess. And then around the idea of, what are those cultural biases and where do those red flags, and Lorraine, you mentioned red flags and tied that quite nicely back into what actually is psychological safety. Am I ever really going to feel safe? I'm only ever going to touch the surface on this question because it's just the nature of the depths, isn't it, of what we're discussing. I am going to hand over now to our next questioner, our next panelist, our next host, Mel. You're going to dive into an even deeper question, I think, a deeper topic.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know who I'm directing this question to. I shall ask the question and then kind of see who occurs to me. But I kind of want to tease how important it is that we know our history and the need for education around Black history. So I don't know. I feel like I kind of want to go to Jackie. She's waving her arms around. So just you want me to go, Jackie, go for it. Go for it, Jackie.
I think for me, history, I think we've been talking about this so many times. I think Black history, people try to put it in one space. And once you don't understand the breadth of it, you've kind of misaligned. And I think this is where the assumptions of how Black people should be is equally wrong, because it depends on which part of history you're from. We know if you're a Black person and your lineage is across the Caribbean, do we know that originally you started in Africa? We know that. But the fact of that transatlantic slave trade that the UK tries to always put to America, we never even talk about the UK's part of it. Then you've got the other part where Africans were also involved in it, and there's a lot of disconnect of that. I would talk from someone then you also have the countries that were colonized. So I think once you understand the difference and also who is impacted by that history and how they go through English culture is different. And for me, I talk about being a child, being someone who was born in Uganda, raised, I always say made in Uganda, raised in the UK. I have a completely different history because, Uganda is a British colony. But I've also equally was in Uganda till I was 6. I went back for boarding school. I go back and forth. So I've also been in a majority culture. So I know Black people can achieve to the highest level because I have aunties, I have uncles. I've seen Black people rule countries that I've actually lived in. So my take of when I come into the British society is that, who do you think you're talking to, please? So I have a very different way of how I'm going to walk life. And so I'm always mindful that I probably will challenge a lot more because the history that I come from and the lineage is very different, whilst I've also equally been able to live through my being Black and understanding being a minority and being teased for being that minority as well. So once you understand the history of the different Black culture, I think the world will have a very different view. But right now I just think there's this one view that is so dangerous. And also Black history is part of English British history that I don't understand how we disconnect, like they're not as connected. Today is Uganda's Independence Day, and it is one where I'm like, actually it's Independence Day, but I live in the same country Uganda got independence from. Did you know what I mean? So there's a lot around that I think history also develops you in who you are, whereas someone who's born and bred in England, they're third, fourth generation, they came through the Caribbean, they're going to have a completely different aspect of what representation mean, the confidence in how they carry themselves. And I think linking it back to psychological safety, and you tend to see even the reports tell us, why we see a lot of Africans perform a certain well, there's a lot of things to carry with that, because there's a lot of history around how they look at education or how they've perceived that, but they have lived in countries where they rule their countries. People are living, and it's different. And being an African woman, funny enough, me and my friends were saying this, every woman I know in my family either works or owns their own business, and it's quite senior. Actually, a lot of my friends who are African, they're in very, very senior positions. So again, when I look at representation, it's going to be diverse. So Mel, I think history, if it's not looked back on, we can miss actually we cannot give the right people the support. We can just perpetrate the current issues and not really take time to give it to the right people.
Absolutely. Or a one-size-fits-all sort of approach to what you think is tackling the problem, which is just essentially the wrong thing to do. So it goes back to that point, no two human beings are the same. They don't come from the same backgrounds and history. So for me, for example, my history is completely different. Okay, my mum was from the Caribbean, my dad's white. I was born in the UK, and I would say that arguably my mum, even though she was the black parent, went out of her way to make her children white, okay, or to live a white existence. So I went to a pretty much all white school, all white education largely. And a lot of the blackness was sort of, so this is the forced identity thing where almost you kind of forced down a particular route to kind of fit into a certain culture. And certainly that was my experience. There was a real sort of cultural and heritage disconnection, quite a deliberate one, on my mum's behalf, because she just felt you have a better life if you fit in the world that you've been born into. But actually it creates its own trauma being disconnected from that history. Okay, because you are different, you have that difference. You can't make your skin white, even if you're brought up in that white culture. So it's really, really challenging, and not being able to have that connection to your heritage in a meaningful way is really difficult. But I could understand fully how we would go down that road, or my mother would go down that road, because actually she's thinking, what's the best thing I can do for my children in the UK? And mixed race children, and that was her view at the time. So I'm sure if she thought, well, she's not alive today to sort of to comment on it, but I'm sure if she saw how the world has really moved on, and I mean, I know there is so much more to do, but it's really moved on in terms of representation, in terms of, you see every night on the TV, don't you, see adverts, and lots of black actors and actresses must be making loads of money at the moment because they're on all the TV adverts and on every TV show. And some might argue it's an overrepresentation. I don't think it is. It's an amplification of voice. I think it's about showing that we all do similar things. Our similarities are more than our differences at the end of the day. So black people do use laundry detergent, and they do go shopping at Lidl, and they do they do normal things that everybody does, and they get insurance, and they worry about funerals, and they do, we are all people. We worry about all those things. And that's what representation kind of looks like. But the education piece is really, really important. And certainly it's something I've been sort of challenging myself with a lot more as I've got older, is just sort of really having that education. But it's quite painful. And I think that's where the anger comes in, Marcia. When you were talking earlier about anger, it's not anger, it's pain. So when you look back at some of that history, for some people, that history isn't particularly painful. It comes from a place of power for a black person. For others, the history is very, very painful. So when you start looking back into it, it sort of exposes a legacy of something that's quite challenging to deal with. Hence, ending up, somebody like my mum who just goes, that's so painful, let's try and erase it almost in future generations. But you never can. You can't erase culture, you can't erase heritage, you can't erase history. And it's really important that we don't. So to me, this really matters. This education piece is not trying to erase it, forget it. We draw a line here, and from this point forward, we move on. Actually, history is just so important in every aspect of what we do, but particularly around Black history, to really understand that full range, that full dynamic, and that full impact of Black history on Black people as they live their lives today. It's so important. Anyway, who's next with the question? It was a brilliant answer, Jackie. I embellished on it rather too much.
And I that one actually, because
Jackie,
that you said. And I know, like, when my sister moved over to America, for example, she had a very, I call it a colonized view of Black Americans. And so she'd really taken it on that, Black Americans are the problematic people. But equally, I know when I go to Uganda, I'm also called the lost African person. Because anyway, it's all quite. So I actually had time to say to her that I think you need to really take time to understand the issues that Black Americans face, other than coming in as someone who's migrated there and you now have taken on a new idea. And so again, back to your point, education, once you educate yourself and you understand, oh, this is why the issues are in, you start to work, actually, you start to be someone who's like, no, we need to stand against it. And you're right, the trauma it creates for everybody around history, it takes it on a lot of people. It does so much to you on an individual basis and as a group basis that once forgotten, we can't do the same. And I think it's the same with Africans when we come to you can have views of Caribbeans and views of that. It's all just lack of history and their understanding of that pain that Marcia said. And I try and instill it in my son to understand it so he never ever sits there and thinks, no, we sit and I say to him, well, what are you going to do in your generation and in whatever you're in to make sure that you create those spaces, you're honest about the reality of being Black in the UK and challenging the status quo. So at university, I encourage him to really have those in-depth conversations because it's something we picked up with Marcia last time when we said, well, how do we start to make sure the next generation and everyone that follows who's Black starts to understand that so they can also have those conversations with their non-Black counterparts and you should be able to have those conversations but still live together in that society. And I will touch I live in Cambridgeshire now, my friends, because now I have a more diverse friendship group, which I should. They'll call you coconut, and it's breaking even those silly comments of what do you mean? What do you actually mean? And actually, when I've asked people that question, they start to unravel their own mind of, actually, this is not a thing. This shouldn't be a thing. We can all coexist and still talk about those pain, but you can still live life together. And it goes back to your point of you can't just, you can't change whatever exists because the color of your skin's the color of you. You can't do that. So I just wanted to add that nuance on it just because of everything you said.
No, great. Thank you, Jackie. Marcia, did you want to come in on that question about...
I'm ready.
Go for it.
I'm going to try and keep my 6 foot 6. So all of us know we assume in the Black culture we know our past. Yeah? And Jackie is very fortunate to know her past. If you talk to the people who were predominantly born in England, we don't know our past. Yes, we should go and look. And because we don't know our past, right, we listen to our people talking, right, adversely amongst the culture across the breadth of Black people and countries. So, for example, me and Jackie, right, we were having a good conversation. I'm Jamaican. My mum said to me, or learned, right, that Africans look down on us, right, because we're non-educated, we're aggressive, you shouldn't listen to the African people, right, because they slowed us into slavery. So you've got that barrier already because you're listening but not learning or educating yourself about what they were saying. They're talking a load of tripe, excuse my language. Again, right, from the Asian people, right, that we are different, right, our skins are too dark, right, we should be only cleaning people's shoes and cleaning floors and all these slots. And I understand the pain, yeah, but it also breeds the anger. If you look at our young population today, and I think I was having a conversation, I go to plenty of seminars, right, and I'm talking my piece and trying to, learn, educate, how can we change the mindset for the better, right, for the future world? And all of them keep saying, well, you ain't done nothing. Look at you. You said you fought history and made it fair for the Black people, right? And we're still in this thing, right? So what the hell do you know and all this sort? And that takes me aback. So again, right, as a legacy, right, how do we, if we're the second generation particularly, right, learn where we come from? Yeah, what was the unity there for where we've come from? Why have we split up? We know why we split up, right? To educate and bring value and riches and houses. But how do we get into the connotation, right, that Africans are better, Jamaicans are this, the Asians are this, right, and the small island people are stupid and all this stuff, right? Because even now, right, you think, right, where are you from, Jamaica? Where are you from, Obama? Oh, we're better than you, right? Because our island's bigger than you. So what? How do we go back and really debunk all the nonsense that is still continuing today, right? And learn. How do we show our vulnerability, right? And hope in this conversation, again, I was having conversations with the predominantly white people upstairs. This is not my natural language. My natural language is this, wagwan. That's my natural language. But how do we impress them and call it out to them, right? For you to accept us, I have to talk like the Queen. And when we even go bend over backward to make ourselves vulnerable to accept into their society, right, we still look down on, but we don't call it out. How do we do that? How do we have the courage as a people to call it out? Which is different from the narrative we had before, right? Because we are good at them. Man, I'm punching, I'm thinking all this up, which gives them say, well, you know, those black people, right? They're angry. Yeah, they don't know how to talk, right? It's always aggressive. How do we reflect, right? And then using our education, right, to understand, right, to reset the mindset, to rethought the thought process, right, which we're going to go on about hope. For me, representation for me is that I represent the very best that we are. We have to, which is a good thing and a bad thing, right? Do 10 times better than the white person. But that's the negative we breathe into our kids. We should be saying, right, I want you to train 10 times better than them, right? Because that way, right, you can reach your potential. You can own your business. You can go anywhere in the world and be your authentic self and bring your intentional to make change. How do we change that narrative, right? And be a true reputation, right, of a human being who breathes the same fresh air, who has the same flipping blood. God gave my color, which I love. Yeah. But how do we get those people to see past your color? Yeah. Now I may have gone on a tangent, right? So I'm going to shut up.
It's always good, Marcia, to listen to you. I suppose one of the things I sort of picked up in there, again, it goes back to that sort of anger and sort of how do we create a place where we're clear and unapologetic. I think that was kind of the words used very, very early in the conversation. So we want to be clear. We don't want to apologise. Don't want to apologise for being different. But we do want to educate people to understand how it is that we're going to move forward in relationships so that we feel heard and we feel represented and we feel that our points of view are as respected as anybody's points of view, I guess, at the end of the day. And some of that is, you know, us all having to educate ourselves on how we create that dialogue, I guess, but from a place of really understanding where we all sit within that dialogue. I think that's just so important. But yeah, that
just
clear
around that piece, that educational piece amongst ourselves, right, is how we agree we've gone through pain, but where, and let's be honest, it is pain, which leads into anger. How do we manage that anger? Because again, like when it was me, Jackie and Shireen, the conversation was so rich, the anger came out. Yeah. So if we look at it and reflection, right, where we were having that rich conversation, it came out as passion. But if you look on the flip side, it comes out as anger. So how do we manifest that and really, right, say, right, how do we, yeah, we're pain, yeah, we're angry, but how do we say, right, how do we have that narrative, right, and that conversation that the opposites don't see it as pain? They have to understand the pain. Sorry, they have to understand the pain they've gone through, but how do we give the narrative, right, that it's not anger?
So Lorraine, have you got anything to add to that?
I do indeed. And tradition for me is an interesting one because I've got a 9-year-old daughter and who I'm a single parent to, and she's so woke, and it's horribly scary just how aware this future generation is now. So there's a time when she asked me, why do they call us black if we're not black? Then I stood still and I didn't have an answer for that. And then you've got 1 month after the whole entire curriculum where they talk about Black history. And her, similar to yourself, Mel, she's like the only Black girl within her year at school. And I think there's only other 2 Blacks who've joined the junior school now, but she was genuinely the only person of color at that particular time. But there's some Asians, but I mean Black, you know. So when they're teaching Black history and they're telling these young children how the white man had superiority over a Black person, what's going on in this children's psychology, like already starting to understand, okay, you're the weakest link. There was a time when I could own you, because it's we have to remind ourselves of the history, but how do we do it in a way that we're protecting these children to say, you know what, it happened, but it was bad. You know, because they acted in this way. These are the consequences. We need to constantly appreciate what our ancestors did. They fought for our freedom. And not only was freedom just given to us, we had to kind of fight for it, for them to write it on a piece of paper and say, yes, you are free now. So it wasn't even a general consensus of people just saying, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to have any slaves anymore. Go about. A law had to come out to give us our freedom. And then we're teaching these children at school to say Black History Month means X, you know, and it was only abolished like about 100 years ago. I think that's when the final abolishment of slavery kind of, and it's not a long time ago at all, 100 years ago. You know, it's recent, but it's then becomes much harder for us to have children learn about Black History Month. Then they come home already feeling as if they're already the weakest link. And then it's up to us as Black parents as well to teach them that, you know, it's a better world, it'll get better, but it's really not, because us at work as well, we have to learn as well about our history. We need to find ways to be psychologically safe. But then what about the children, where it actually starts? Because I think it starts there. You know, and some of them, it's not their fault. It's genuinely not their fault. Because I sat down, I'm in an interracial relationship at the moment. So I sat down with my partner's parents and was trying to just speak, because I asked them all these questions and I wanted to have a different perspective. I think to what Mel said, that I'm only one representation. And what's the world like for people who are actually having the opportunity to come into a Black female's home and to interact with me on a personal level? And you'll be so surprised that the world is very accommodating, especially people who are just normal. It's very accommodating, and they want to know a bit more about our history. They want to love us better and to do better. But where does it all go wrong? I'm still really trying to understand, like, even if you look at Network World right now, there's no female Black leaders in senior positions, even Black males in senior positions. Where is it going wrong? I don't know, but yeah, so history is good, and unlearning it is good, but I think unlearning it, knowing that we've got these provisions in place, that won't just keep living us being the weakest link because we were enslaved, you know. So it's interesting, but yeah. So.
And that's a good point.
Yes, go Marcia.
That is a good point, right? So I'm 63 years and I've been fighting this for God knows how long. Excuse me, Lord. Yeah. But what has the fight that we have done and continue to do, right? Safeguarding our kids. And Lorraine, thank you for that story, right? And I didn't even realize it, that our kids, right, are being devalued, dehumanized, right? Feel as the fifth token. Yeah. Wow. Got a lot of way to go. Sorry, Jackie, interrupted.
It's okay. But do you know what? I think when it comes to schools, and this is for me, my issue around Black history, is it is taught currently from the white saviorism, and that's not fair. So I don't know if any of you has ever watched Woman King, because Woman King would be a very clear reminder. And I think if history has to be understood from both sides. And you're right, you know, I have I've had to raise a Black boy in this society, and that's already hard. But I think, Lorraine, you're right, there is a lot of pressure, even Black History Month. Someone put it the other day on their LinkedIn and saying being Black in October is actually hard work. And it really is. It's hard work. It's hard work being Black. And then being Black, we're always the ones of do this. And then at some point, I'm like, actually, 1 minute here. Let me understand. So once a year, you're remembering. And I think it is hard. But we have to remember, this is why there's a lot of challenge around the history and how it's taught for Black people, because that is not fair to talk about. It's one way. Because if I look at slavery wasn't abolished. A lot of Black people fought for it to end alongside white allies. And I think we need to start having the right conversation, challenge the narrative that's not true, because it's not true. And also, when we talk about abolishing, we were paying the slave owners money until 2015. We all paid that tax. So let's all remember the history of what is really going on here. Did you know what I mean? But we have to remember it's a two-way street.
But already, if we teach it in that angle, there is because they have to protect their own, I feel, when they roll out this curriculums, not to then pinpoint at the white children and say, because of your ancestors, that's why we're like this.
But I don't think there's a pinpointing around it. I think it's just tell the history and the truth. Because so what? Are we okay to make Black kids feel like their ancestors hidden for the sake? Like, it's not fair on anyone.
Fair. Yeah. Because
sorry, I really
sorry.
But you have to put yourself. Sorry, you've got to put yourself right. So right, we are talking about it, right? We are listening, right? Both across the breadth of our education, right? But imagine, right? You've been taught as a white person, right, that you were the power and you were this, right, and you were this, and it still happens today, right? Then you've got to go into school, and by the way, you white kids, right? It's because of us, right? That's why these Black people feel that. That's going to take a lot of courage, a lot of allyship, and a lot of discussion. But it should happen. But yeah.
So I've got a sort of slightly. I just want to jump in with this sort of slightly interesting view here, not different, and I hear everything that everybody's saying. So we want to educate, okay? We want to talk about history, okay? And we want Black people, all different types of Black people and people of colour, to feature in that history. And where we've ended up, it feels like, and you know, I've got children at school as well, is that we educate children on Black history about the hard history, which is important that we have the hard history in there. But we don't seem to have an everyday vehicle for just educating about history that happens to be involve Black people. So actually, where they should be peppering the curriculum with is famous people, you know, celebrated people throughout history, some of whom happen to be Black, rather than the focus all being on, you know, slave trading, and which is a horrible, horrible point in history and ought to always have its own place on a curriculum, a bit like the World Wars are on a curriculum. Well, this was the war against Black people back in the day, and it should have its own curriculum. Absolutely should be taught in schools. But what I'm saying is the rest of history lessons, whatever the subject and domain within history, whether it's blooming the Industrial Revolution, guess what? Black people were around during the Industrial Revolution. You know, we should be talking about the positive success. You know, if you want to do a service to our future generations, then we should be talking, looking back into history about how Black people have promoted success, have saved lives, have brought on technology, and they do, and they have, and they've been some of the most important inventors and, you know, scientists. But we don't talk, and we educate our children to these particular figures in moments of time that happen to be white. Whereas we could actually have a much broader spectrum of education that included all facets of life, all facets of human being. And that's where we get it wrong. It's not that we shouldn't be talking about hard history around some of those sort of, you know, Black history issues, which absolutely should. I think they're vital for all of us to be educated around that. But it isn't a them and us. It isn't a, you know, it's more about broadening out the whole curriculum and saying, and where do Black people play into all of our history, good and bad?
So
that's
I'm going to.
I love that.
I'm going to be cheeky.
Marcia, I want to bring you into the next question. The next question you're asking. The next question.
Right. So, question is right. So, love all of that. Right. You're saying the right analogy and all this lot. Right. How do we just bring what Mel said in right to the education system? What responsibility do we have? So, the next question you can hear, right? Hope. Yeah. What does hope look like? Yeah. How do we support the hope? How do we support the vision? Right. What does it look like? And most importantly, right, what is our role? What is our role, right, for our children with hope? Again, going back to Mel, right, we should honor the past, right? It was bad. It is bad. It's left a deep, deep scar. But how do we celebrate the success? And how do we get that through to our kids? And you have to use the school and the university to get that into kids. So how do we support the schools, the universities having that education? So I'm going to go.
I'm going to answer that question. So how many of us around the table have got children in school or have had children in school? Is that all of us?
Yeah.
I've had.
Have or had, they may have left this education system now. And how many of us have asked this question into the school. So Jackie might have done, because she popped her hand up straight away. How many of us have gone into the school and said, "How do you teach about Black history in your school?" So Marcia may well have done, and Jackie may well have done. Don't think I have. I think I've gone in when they were at primary and had a really good conversation about how they talk about women in school, which is very interesting with the headmistress, but probably haven't gone down this route. I think that's a place that we can start challenging. It's in our own schools, can't we? We can go back in and have conversations with our children about, well, what are they teaching you about Black history, and how is that featuring in your education? And then really spend that time going into schools and starting to ask them, actually, are you sure you're featuring it in the right way? I know what the intent is. Lorraine, the intent, I guess, will be not to... So I think somebody used the word white saviour sort of mentality. I'm sure there's no intentional white saviour behaviour, but that's what ends up happening. And that's what it ends up manifesting at. That's how your child ends up feeling a certain way when they're educated. But how do we educate the schools? How do we educate not just schools in our own workplaces? How do we educate about actually how do you do Black history, Black education well? Because it's not just peddling out the story of slavery, and it's everything. It's all the wonderful positive things that have happened in the world because Black people are in it.
Yeah.
And that point again is absolutely brilliant, right? So again,
that for me would be hope.
Oh yes, yes.
Connection's not good.
And I'm going to ask Cherie, right, to do an extra piece of work, right? As a group, a collective of women, and understanding what we're going at, what could we put together as a narrative, right, to put into the schools? That's a later piece of work, yeah. But and again, it's part of the hope is, right, how do we together, right, put a narrative together that can go into schools and the universities and the workplace? So, Lorraine, your thoughts?
So I think Mel's question about challenging the school, I've been protective because when you look at the teachers, there's no Black teacher in most of the schools that my daughter's been in. The one she was in London, there was one Black teacher who was a PE teacher. So if I was to put anything in writing raising my concerns about the Black History Month, there is that fear that then the teachers will look at my daughter as an, oh my God, we need to be so extra sensitive with her. We can't really, we're being racially policed or something. There is always that risk that could potentially be there. So I've never sat down to say to the school, I really want to understand this and I really want to understand that, because of that fear, because the teachers are not even well represented. So it's quite hard. So I think to Marcia's point, it may start with actually incentivizing more people of Black color to say, do you want to be teachers? We'll give you an extra amount of, of this incentive if you go into the education route, because we need more Black teachers for our kids to resemble in. So on that point, I've always been quite hesitant to not necessarily cause trouble, because my daughter, the children are still so innocent and the responsibility is with the teachers. And I don't know if everyone saw that video of the girl was in Wales with the medal. And the teacher omitted this one Black girl and didn't give, that girl the medal. So it's you don't want to set that narrative as being the complaining parent, and so. But that's the reason why. But I think going forward, I'll take your advice, Mel, or what the other ladies have done on the call, and just drop a note and be like,
I haven't done it on the Black history issue. I did it because I had a real issue around teachers talking about mummies and daddies being the stay-at-home dad, being the working person, and mummies being the... That really frustrated me, because it was becoming an issue for my children. They felt very different because their mum operated in a very different way to some of the other mums. So I had to do something about that. But I've never thought about this issue. I have now. This just having this conversation has really, really got me thinking about it. And this isn't about challenging. This is back to Marcia's earlier words, which is just being clear and unapologetic. I want to understand how you're educating around Black history, and I want you to understand how that might not be the best way. That I want you to educate my child and all children around Black history. I want you to do it, but I do want you to understand how you might do it better. It's how you explain that.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to apologise for thinking that you could do it better. but I do need to explain to you clearly why I think you can do it better. And for me, it's about bringing to life Black history through the entire curriculum. It's about bringing to life all cultures and all religions and all facets of life alive through history, through British history, through history of the world, and that being a better way than picking a month and talking about slavery. Even though I do think, you know, those hard histories are important as well.
Do you know
And just picking up on Lorraine's.
Sorry,
just
Marcia,
picking up
on the hope.
on your fear for your children. Yeah,
because you
it's the
fear
courage.
that. Because
understand
when you
your
look at
fears, right? But
Yeah.
how do we, again, right? So we have to go into the schools, we have to go into the university systems, yeah? We have to, right, show them, right, through conversations through our kids, right, what you're teaching, right, is making my child feel this, yeah? And I would like to have a conversation how we can make it better. But my fear is, right, that you'll think, right, oh, we're going too woke. So another analogy could be, right, is how do we give the confidence to our children and us in the background to say to them, right, with your teaching, right, this is how you're making me feel. Because more voices, background, in other way, can be very, very powerful. Sorry, you were going to say about hope.
It's about hope. So I was interested in viewing this question, like, again, using my in-laws as my benchmark to say, because they're like in their 70s, and what do they think from what they've seen, having to go through the Windrush and everything, and where we are now and what they potentially can envision could happen in the future. And with them, it wasn't a straight cut answer, because the world is still, like, now we've got a prime minister who's a minority, and the comments that spring up because, you know, with his speech and everything, that comments that come out, that you cannot sit down and say England does not have a racist culture at all. It's physically there, but it's only just that they're now hiding behind social media. You won't go to the store and have somebody be racially abusive to you at all. But they can now, they've got a facade, they're hiding it behind all these computers. And to them, I think the key thing was we just have to learn to respect each other and to respect what's happened with us in the past, and to say, yes, Black History Month is there. We're not going to forget what our ancestors did for you, Lorraine, to say, okay, they fought for you, they were enslaved and all of that. Let's appreciate that. But there's also the other side of the narrative of all the good that the Black people are doing. So let's focus on that. Let's have more Obamas in the world. Maybe if the children were to go onto a train and they don't see just Black people cleaning the train, and for example, they see more Black people in the parliament and all of that, it might start to, you know, remove that bias or remove that thought process that comes with understanding that Black people were enslaved. So I think it's a society thing that we all just need to do, and keep fighting and knocking on that door. Otherwise, no one is ever going to care if we don't keep standing up for ourselves, which is why I started Ethnicity and Race in REL. So fingers crossed, you know, the REL industry with this massive bias around, you know, the white male being predominant in there will completely go. But it's up to us. It's our responsibility to represent ourselves and get ourselves from this bias, I suppose. Yeah.
So I love that hope.
Yeah.
Love that hope. I love that vision, right? And I suppose the question is, right, so I said, but I've been fighting this for 40 years. How are we going to do it? Yeah. So again, right, with these podcasts are brilliant, right? We talk about it. We talk about the pain, right? We talk about the aspiration, we talk about the vision. So the question is, right, here about against hope. What are we going to do?
Can I have a different perspective?
Of course, Jackie.
I think for me, one thing I struggle with is, I'm probably on Lorraine's point, is, and Mela loved that point of what are we doing for this school? Because I think hope comes through some real hard hit. You're going to have to go through some harder conversations sometimes, unfortunately. And I always have to say that to people, that it's never going to be a comfortable conversation. And I think we all need to grapple with that pain. And Lorraine, to your point, my son was always the tallest in his age group. And was he boisterous? Yeah, he was. But the instant he would do anything, the teachers would want to label him back to oh, he's dangerous. So, and I'll give you what I mean. When, by the time he was in year 10 or 9, my son was already 6 foot, right?
Wow.
And straight away, anything he would do, the teachers looked at it like I'm scared. And I had to sit down and say, listen, right? You being scared, what makes you scared? I had to walk them through how they've got to their scared. Did I know they were stereotyping him? 100%. But that's not how I'm going to go to that conversation. But I'll get them to think about what they just did and how they've now profiled a child that is just a child that happens to be really tall. And he's had something that I've had to challenge, like you, Mel. So it's like I had to deal with it. Not dealing with it would have killed my son's. So for me, it's not even about the teachers. I've got to build my son up to know that he is going to be in the minority. He's already built in a system that is stereotyped against him. I empower him, but it's equally been very important for me for him to see that I challenge the system as well. So a teacher saying they're really scared of him, well, what made you feel scared of him? It's not my fault. You're 5'6" and my son's 6 foot. I can never change that. It's not my fault. So if you're scared of him because of your height difference, I can't do anything of that because it's none of his control and your control. But you've got to come to the point of why a 6 foot child scares you. You've got to deal with that issue yourself from a personal perspective and actually focus on the actual child's issues. And I'm happy to talk for and support that. But, and also, does he have a voice that he challenges? Of course he does, because he's been raised to have that. So I think we have to remember that any hope to happen, it's going to take us as a minority group to keep challenging that status quo and to have those conversations and challenge. And another one was where I was with the HR team and they said, well, people would open up, for example, and recruit all these people. So I said, well, which people? So when those people behave a certain way, they were talking about Black people, they will just change their mind and not offer them jobs anymore. I said, do you use that same narrative when it's white people? No, you don't. You know what I mean? And I think we have to change how we question, because if someone brings you those challenges, we've got to start questioning people in how they present things to us, because you've got to walk them through what's going through their mind and how they've got because some people just say it because it's been normal to just say those things. So I think part of it is changing that conversation around and starting to gauge their understanding and get them to look at things differently and not in a stereotypical head. And I do that personally. If I see someone I don't know from nowhere, I've already made assumptions of them. I have to go through my mental capacity of, you do not know this person. You do not know them. You've just met them. And you're going to have to meet them at where they are. They might look like what you think, but actually just get to know them. And I think that takes a lot of challenge and it's quite hard to do.
I love that analogy. Yes, it is quite hard to do that. Again, like just a couple of things about, so when you went to the school, that your son's height, was it to height and the stereotype that he's a tall Black boy?
No, so what they said to me is the teacher said we were teachers trained and he said how my son intimidates him. So I had to ask him, well, how does intimidate you? And everything got to, it was his height. So I said, okay, but a child's height how does that intimidate you? So do you know what I mean? I had to walk through because everything, it sounded like a stereotype of a Black boy being scary.
That's what I wanted to get to. Thank you very much.
So that's how he led it, but I'm not going to lead that conversation. Like, I'm going to make you break it down to me so that you realize that you just stereotyped my son and we're not doing that. And to get them to think and challenge their thought process around.
That's why I was asking for clarity, right? So because we're in the know, right? So if people listen to this, right? Well, why would she challenge somebody because he's 6'4"? I mean, the total analogy is right, but the main thing, well, he's tall, he's intimidating because of the stereotyping of his color. That was the added edge, because you can have the same white boy who's 6'5", but they wouldn't have that stereotype. So that's why I was trying to clarify, right, the reasoning and the conversation, which is absolutely brilliant. Again, so I'm going to be cheeky, right? Shireen, what's your hope, baby girl, in the future? What would you like to see in the next
thank you for
5 years?
For the next 5 minutes. Do you know what? Just listening to the podcast today, like so much new information has come to me. but also I can really see the synergies amongst loads of senses of otherism, but certainly as a, you know, British Asian, my parents came over 50s, 60s, you know, you're looking at similar Windrush time where people were brought over to really rebuild the country. And I was never taught any of that. So I was taught a lot of shame when I was younger. I was taught a lot of, you're lucky you're in this country. I was taught a lot of just that sense of really happy to be here kind of vibe. And so I've taken that into my adulthood as well, which is I'm just always super happy to be invited in the room until I realised I deserve to be in those rooms. And that's taken a real self-education. I've had to raise 9-year-old me and, you know, right the way to 40-something plus me in just a really understanding who am I. And I have a child, and you know, similarly to Jackie, I'm raising him to have a voice, to question and to being curious, inquisitive, because the world genuinely is his oyster. But would I be remiss to telling him some of the rough stuff? I probably will tell him at some point. He's 4. I'll save it for now. I mean, these kids that he's looking at venturing out into space, so for him it's like Earth and beyond. So I really take everyone's point around the history. We must know where we've come from. We must educate ourselves to educate others. I think you shouldn't have to be part of a group to know about that group. I think listening to podcasts, being involved in conversations, knowing what your staff networks are, being, you know, talking to your children, being involved in your community. I think all of those things, for me, I'm learning that as a grown-up as well. But I think for me, that's where hope comes in, is how am I showing up for other people? How am I showing up for myself? Am I being a real ally to bring people into conversations? Am I being aware of my bias? And I'm not an EDI person. I'm just incredibly curious. And I think in that curiosity, what can we learn that are similar about each other? Actually, differences are good too. And I don't want to be surrounded by people who just agree with me all the time. I want to learn. I want to be challenged. So I think in having those difficult conversations, we can get to success. And I think in talking about the rough stuff, the good stuff, the bad stuff, etc., I think it's okay. And I think we're in a real space of a new space of enlightenment. I'm having all of these conversations and on social media and all the rest of it, and you can call it wokeism, whatever you want to call it, but I think people are knowing now. We've got an age where there's so much information at our fingertips, is using it in the right way to lay that foundation. There's a few things that I know it's really world changing, but I think by having these incremental steps, we can actually get to a real space of revolution. I really think we can be in a better world.
Love that opinion, right? As I say, right, we have to learn from the past, right? Bring out the best from the past, right? But which informs the future. You know, from my hope is, and I hope I'll still be alive, is to see that people can have honest conversation, right? So if somebody makes a comment which is adverse to that people, instead of like going and getting a knife because he said that and stab him, having a conversation, say like, what you said really upset me. Yeah, and the reason why it upset me, right? Take time to learn, right? My past, my present, my future. Yeah, and kids between Lorraine's point, right, going into school, right, and having a conversation when they're learning Black history and say, whoa. I'm proud to be Black, Asian, green, orange, disability, right? You need to change your narrative. Yeah, instead of our kids coming over, right? And again, to Lorraine's point, I love that her daughter said, am I Black? What's colour got to do with it? What has it got to do with it? Absolutely nothing. So for my hope, I'm hoping that I can see a 1% turnaround. Those positive conversations, the positive education, right? The kids thriving, showing their value, their intent, having the courage to call it out in a way that it's education, right, to everybody across the piece. That is my hope.
Marcia, I think you've closed the podcast beautifully by bringing everyone's points together. So really thank you for that. Before we do a proper close, is there anything anyone else as like a one word that anyone wants to throw in? But I feel like you surmised it perfectly there.
I want to hear from Mel. Mel, I want to hear from all of you.
Sorry, mine's one word to say, but I think when you're checking in with your children and telling them and educating about the Black history and all of that and what it means to be a minority, if that's an acceptable word, you know, the podcast, but check in and see what the tolerance levels are with your children, because if I was to have that full-on conversation with my daughter right now, it will literally traumatize her for a very long time, and she'll find, because that's a character. So understand those psychological kind of like things that surround and what makes your daughter, what breaks, or your children, should I say, and then be comfortable in having those conversations. But if you just go to a child who's already sensitive and then you pour in all this information to them, it's a lot for them to take on. So again, let's respect each other's kind of thresholds around what's acceptable. Other people want to be Black, other people want to be brown. Other people don't want to be identified as, as a race at all. It's one human race. But I think we will work to a better future once we understand that whether a person wants to be identified as Black, brown, or British, or whichever one, it's got no bearing to a person's actual, ability to love and to care and all of that. So let's just respect each other in terms of what our thresholds are, because it's, it's our own lives and stuff. But yeah, I think that's...
I love that. Yeah, thank you for being honest there. Right. Sorry, Shireen, I know I'm going to open my mouth again.
Sorry.
Yeah, that is brilliant, Mike. So that's a learning for us, right? How old are your kids?
I've got one, she's 9. She's 9.
9. So my hope is, right, that how do we, right, from an early age, right, and make sure it's relevant to the age, safeguard them, right, so they can have those types of conversations. So we've done our best, whether we like it or not. Each generation, right, we always try to protect our kids, which is absolutely right. But on the other side is, right, your daughter's 9, right, and you are absolutely right. We have to take time to understand, right, and safeguard their mental health, right, and where they fit in. But how do we start changing that narrative, right, from an early age, right, that the kids are going to hear these kind of things, right, and make them feel confident and proud to be Black and know your history, both bad and good. That's something that we have to work on.
Thank you, Marcia. Jackie, your one line as a conclusion.
Sorry.
And then Melanie, be cheeky.
I'm going to shut up.
Cheeky. No, do you know what? It's a beautiful conversation, and look at the topic. So I'm being cheeky by saying that. But yeah, Jackie, to you, and then to Mel, please.
I think for me is be okay with saying the hard stuff and having hard conversation, because it always builds better foundations. If I think about our roads, I think for me, when I look at the bridges, we always have to put in firm foundations for them to be fit. And, that goes through a lot of breaking earth and a lot of work. So I think with this as well is really start, have those very in-depth and meaningful conversations, and be okay with those awkward moments, because you come out quite well at the end of that tunnel. So for me, is be courageous to have those hard, difficult conversations, but know that at the end of it, only the best things come out of that.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Mel, to you.
Yeah, just one last thing, which is always my observation, I guess. So you can't change yourself. There's nothing. You can't change yourself. You are what you are. Female, Black, Asian. You can't change a fundamental fact about yourself. But you can change how people perceive you. That's all you can do in life, is change how people perceive you. And you want them to perceive the best of you, don't you, at the end of the day? So it's just to remember that we're the representation. We're out there, we're living our lives, doing our thing, inspiring others, I hope, because we're representing. So I'll go back to my original point, but we represent. You can't change yourself, but you can change how others perceive you. And you'll be doing good when you're doing that as well, because you'll be creating that perception for others as well. If you're a good representation of what it means to be a strong Black woman in the UK, then you are a leading light for others as well. So don't forget, we represent.
I love that. What a beautiful, beautiful place to end it. And these conversations they're so rich, and we're only ever going to touch the surface with this. And with these podcasts, it's about opening up the conversations, creating a safe space so we can really speak about what's true in our hearts, and not just kind of give a party political line as we so often have to do, right? It's about really saying what does it mean to be a human being. And in our next season of podcast, we're really going to go into those depths and those minutiae, and some of the words we said today. And we mentioned trauma quite a lot. We mentioned shame quite, in a couple of bits. around microaggressions. We kind of touched upon what some of those things look like. We've talked about authenticity, representation, the fluidity of change. There's so many things that we've covered. And so, you know, I always say this, being a human being is really, really messy, but it can also be really wonderful. And how can we support each other in all those journeys? And so I hope that you've had a good conversation and you've taken away some thoughts that you might implement as well. And certainly those listening, there are opportunities to engage through our socials and through the poll that comes out with the podcast. Tell us what you think, tell us what's landed, tell us what we should be doing more of as well. And yeah, with that, just thank you so much to our guests today and for you to listening as well.
You've been listening to the Women in Transport podcast. Join us next time as we hear more from the women in our sector. Please visit the website for more details on how to become a member of Women in Transport, and remember to like, follow and share this podcast.